welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really getting into the weeds on evolutionary selection. We're going beyond just, the basic definition.
Yeah, we want to explore the actual mechanisms, the really complex ways life gets shaped.
Exactly. How do these environmental pressures actually translate into changes we see over generations, in genes, in how organisms look and function?
Right. And it's not just one thing. Our mission today is looking at the research that built on Darwin and Wallace, seeing how selection works across the whole life cycle.
Survival, reproduction, everything.
From the very start, even gametes, right up to who manages to reproduce more successfully as an adult. It's a constant pressure.
And the sources lay out, 5 or 6 main types?
Yeah.
We've got the classic natural selection modes.
Stabilizing, directional, disruptive. Yeah.
Then sexual selection, which is always fascinating.
Yeah.
And finally, the ones that can get a bit contentious sometimes. Group and kin selection.
Exactly. Those involve some really interesting dynamics, especially when you get into social behaviors.
Okay, let's start with the basics. Selection acts on fitness differences.
Right.
Differences between individuals and their traits.
But the key distinction, and it's important, is that selection itself isn't evolution.
Why not? It feels like it is.
Well, selection works on the phenotype, the traits you can see or measure within a generation. It filters who survives, who reproduces better now.
Okay.
But for evolution to happen, those advantageous changes have to be passed on. They need a genetic basis, or maybe epigenetic.
So it's the change in allele frequencies over generations, driven by that selection, that's the real evolution.
Precisely. Selection is the engine, but heritable change is the journey.
And you need something for the engine to work on, right? Variation.
Absolutely critical. Without variation in traits, selection has nothing to choose between.
But selection can also keep variation around. That seems odd if it's always favoring the best.
Yeah, it does seem counterintuitive. But think about cases where being heterozygous, having 2 different alleles for a gene, is actually better than having 2 copies of either allele.
Like sickle cell trait and malaria resistance.
That's the textbook example. Heterozygotes are protected from severe malaria, even though the sickle cell allele itself can cause disease if you have 2 copies. So selection maintains that allele in malaria-prone areas because the heterozygote has the highest fitness.
Gotcha. Okay, let's tackle that famous phrase, survival of the fittest. Spencer coined it, Darwin used it later. Why do biologists kind of frown upon it?
Well, for one, it can sound a bit circular, Who are the fittest? Those who survive. Who survives the fittest? It doesn't explain why.
Right, it doesn't get at the mechanism.
And the bigger issue, perhaps, is it focuses only on survival.
But it's really about reproduction.
Exactly. Fitness, in an evolutionary sense, is about leaving offspring. You can survive for ages, but if you don't reproduce, your fitness is 0. The phrase misses the heritable reproduction part.
R.A. Fisher nailed it then. Natural selection is not evolution.
A perfect, concise statement. Selection is the process leading to different outcomes in survival and reproduction. Evolution is the result, the change in the gene pool over time.
Okay, let's dive into those 3 classic modes of natural selection acting on individuals. First up, stabilizing selection. The middle ground wins.
Yeah, that's the gist. It's probably the most common type. It favors individuals with traits close to the average for the population. It weeds out the extremes.
And the classic example is Bumpus's sparrows.
Right, Herman Bumpus back in 1898. After a big storm in Rhode Island, he collected sparrows, both survivors and those that died.
And found.
He found that the survivors clustered really tightly around the average body size, wing length, etc. The ones that died tended to be the unusually large or unusually small ones.
So being average was best in that harsh condition.
Exactly. And interestingly, a later look at his data suggested this stabilizing selection was acting more strongly on the females.
Why them specifically?
They showed more variation in size than the males to begin with, so selection had more to act upon to narrow down. It shows how the same pressure can have different effects depending on existing variation.
Interesting. Okay, next. Directional selection. This one things are changing.
Right. When the environment shifts or a population moves into a new niche, selection might favor one extreme phenotype over the others. It pushes the whole average in one direction.
The Illinois corn experiment is a striking example here.
Oh, absolutely. They've been selecting corn for high oil content and low oil content for, over 80 years now? It's incredible.
And the results show that push clearly.
Definitely. The high oil line keeps responding, keeps going up. The low oil line has pretty much bottomed out near 0% oil. It's a powerful demonstration of pushing a trait towards an extreme.
So directional selection finds a new best value for a trait. But how does evolution make sure that new value sticks around, becomes reliable, especially with random mutations popping up?
Ah, that brings us to a really neat concept, canalization. James Rendell's idea.
Canalization, making it robust.
Sort of. Think of it this way. First, directional selection pushes the trait mean to a new optimum, then stabilizing selection takes over to keep it there. But canalization is when selection actually modifies the developmental pathways.
How-
It makes the relationship between the genes, genotype, and the trait, phenotype, less sensitive to small genetic or environmental variations around that new optimum. It buffers development, so even with some underlying genetic variation, you still reliably get the desired trait. It builds resilience into the system.
Like carving a deeper channel for development to flow down.
That's a great way to put it. It ensures the optimal phenotype is produced more consistently.
Okay, the third classic mode, disruptive selection, sometimes called diversifying selection. This one favors the extremes.
Exactly. It's the opposite of stabilizing. Here, individuals at both ends of the phenotypic spectrum have higher fitness than those near the average.
When would that happen?
Often in variable environments where there are multiple distinct resources or niches. Imagine an island with only very small seeds and very large, tough seeds.
Then birds with small beaks do well, birds with large beaks do well.
But birds with medium-sized beaks struggle with both. So selection favors the two extremes.
And this is important because it can lead to...
It's thought to be a major driver of things like sexual dimorphism, distinct differences between males and females, and potentially even the splitting of one species into two, speciation. It creates distinct forms within a population.
Right, okay, that covers the natural selection modes. Now let's shift gears to sexual selection. This is specifically about mating success.
Precisely. It's selection acting on traits that influence an individual's likelihood of finding a mate and reproducing. It often acts differently on males and females.
And that difference often comes down to investment, right? Eggs versus sperm.
That's the classic explanation. Females typically invest a lot more energy per gamete large eggs, so their best strategy is often to be choosy about their mate, to ensure that investment pays off.
Whereas males produce cheap, plentiful sperm.
So their strategy often leans towards mating with as many females as possible. This difference in investment sets up a potential conflict.
Though roles can reverse, like the emperor penguins you mentioned. The male does all the incubating.
Absolutely. When male parental investment is high, you can see selection pressures shift. But generally, Darwin identified two main forms of sexual struggle arising from this asymmetry.
What are they?
First, competition within one sex, usually males competing with each other for access to females. This drives the evolution of weapons like antlers or horns, or simply larger body size.
Like those massive northern fur seal males, 7 or 8 times bigger than females.
A really extreme example of male-male competition driving size dimorphism. Huge males defend harems.
And the second struggle.
The struggle to attract or charm the opposite sex. This is where female choice comes in, driving the evolution of elaborate male ornaments or displays.
Peacock tails, bright bird plumage, things that seem like they'd make survival harder.
Exactly, which leads to the handicap principle.
The idea being that if a male can survive despite carrying around this huge, costly tail, he must be really high quality genetically.
That's the core idea. The ornament is an honest signal of fitness precisely because it's costly to produce and maintain. Only males in good condition can afford the handicap.
It's like saying, look how fit I am. I can waste resources on this ridiculous tail and still be alive.
Pretty much. And selection can act fast on these traits. There's a study on barn swallows.
Ah, yes, the tail feathers.
Right. Changing climate conditions seem to favor longer tail feathers in males, and the average length increased significantly, like 11 millimeters in just 20 years. Much faster change than in females.
Wow. And the absolute extreme of sexual selection strategy.
Has to be something like the male Australian redback spider, suicidal mating.
Where the male encourages the female to eat him.
Yeah. By positioning himself over her fangs during mating, he gets eaten, but research shows this allows him to mate for longer and transfer more sperm compared to males that escape.
He dies, but his genes win the reproductive lottery.
It's a stark reminder that fitness is purely about passing on genes, not personal longevity.
Okay, that perfectly sets up our last category, group and kin selection. This moves beyond the individual.
Right. Group selection is the idea that selection can favor traits that benefit the whole group or population, even if they might be disadvantageous to the individual carrying them.
This was controversial for a while, wasn't it? Because individual self-interest usually wins out.
It was, and selection within groups favoring selfish individuals is often stronger. But group-level advantages can evolve, especially if selection on individuals and groups pushes in the same direction, like cooperation in hunting benefiting everyone involved.
Is there experimental evidence?
There is. A classic experiment used flower beetles, Tribolium. By selecting entire groups based on their population size, researchers created populations that differed massively in size, like 200%, showing group-level traits can respond to selection.
And this leads to concepts like altruism.
Yes, where an individual performs an action that benefits others at a cost to itself. Like that monkey giving an alarm call, it draws attention to the caller.
But warns the rest of the group, who are often relatives.
Exactly. Which brings us neatly to kin selection. This is really a specific, powerful form of group selection focused on the advantage of helping relatives who share your genes.
So the warning colors on poisonous insects, aposematism.
Perfect example. One individual might get eaten by a naive predator, but the predator learns to avoid that pattern, saving the eaten individual's nearby siblings who share the same warning colors and the underlying genes.
The sacrifice benefits shared genes and relatives.
Precisely. And the mathematics of this, especially William Hamilton's work on ants, bees, and wasps, the Hymenoptera, is just revolutionary.
This is where the haplodiploidy comes in, the weird sex determination.
Yes. Males develop from unfertilized eggs, so they're haploid one set of chromosomes. Females develop from fertilized eggs, they're diploid two sets.
And this messes with relatedness in a big way.
Huge. Because of this system, female workers are actually more closely related to their full sisters than they would be to their own daughters.
Wait, run that by me again?
A female worker gets half her genes from her mother, the queen, and half from her father. Her sister gets the same half from the father, since he's haploid and passes on identical sets, and shares, on average, half of the mother's genes, added up. Half plus a quarter. Sisters share 75% of their genes on average.
Whereas a mother only shares 50% with her daughter.
Right. So, from a gene's eye view, a female worker propagates her genes more effectively by helping her mother raise more sisters, 75% related, than by having her own offspring, 50% related.
That's incredible. That genetic math literally explains the evolution of sterile worker castes and eusociality in these insects. It's not altruism in the human sense, it's genetic self-interest.
It's the ultimate expression of kin selection driving complex social behavior.
And it even creates internal conflict.
Absolutely. Think about the optimal sex ratio. Workers, being more related to sisters, future queens, benefit genetically from a female-biased colony ratio, maybe 3 females to 1 male.
But the queen.
She's equally related to her sons and daughters, 50% each. So her genetic interest lies in producing a 1.1 ratio. This sets up a fundamental conflict within the colony over resource allocation to males versus females.
Wow. So selection isn't just one simple filter. It's this whole array of processes acting at different levels, shaping everything from body size to mating dances to the very structure of societies.
It really is. Its power comes from acting on any heritable variation that affects survival and reproduction, from tiny details of physiology right up to these intricate genetic conflicts and calculations driving social evolution.
A truly comprehensive force. So as you think about all this, maybe reflect on those genetic conflicts. That tension between the queen bee and her workers over who gets raised it reveals how deeply relatedness, that cold genetic calculus, underlies behaviors we might otherwise label as simple cooperation or sacrifice. It really makes you rethink the why behind so much of the natural world.